Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Joustra, coming to you from NAM, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we're going to be talking about sustainable cooking, health, thrift and environment with Dr. Duane Mellor, who is a UK registered dietitian and science communicator. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's late in the evening over in the UK, but it's good to talk.
Yes, it's quite early here in Melbourne. So the challenges of talking to each other from other sides of the world. But yeah, I think this is going to be a really great talk, so I don't mind. But do you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
So I've been a dietitian for sort of well over 20 years in the UK. I've actually worked in Australia for about 18 months when I was in Canberra. And I've moved from working clinically as a dietitian in the UK, working with people living with diabetes. And one of the first jobs I remember was in a diabetes centre near London, a place called St Helier. Sounds like it's in Jersey, but it's actually in London. And we had a teaching kitchen there. And it was great because we had a brilliant home economist who I used to work with to do teaching demonstrations. So food was a really important part of the work I did then. And then I moved around the UK and started my research, which was using chocolate and sort of looking at some of the health effects of chocolate. I wouldn't say that benefits, but there might be slightly less harm. The benefits are tiny, but not really clinically important. That was fun. That got me to research. And then I've been in teaching in universities ever since. And at the moment, I'm teaching in a medical school, so I'm teaching trainee doctors and also have a role in what we call public engagement. So it's some of it's media, but it's also working with the communities. And some of those projects are linked to food and sort of how to improve health through food, but also looking at some of the issues around cost of living at the moment, which are quite challenging, I think, around the globe.
Yes, certainly in Australia, we're having a bit of a cost of living crisis where food is going up along with energy, housing. So I think very much a relevant topic because, we still need to be able to eat, unfortunately, and pay for everything.
Yeah, it is a challenge, and we need to still enjoy food because it's something we do every day. And I'm a believer that food's not just about the nutrition and the chemicals in it, which can keep us healthy or so too many of the things that are not good for us, but also looking at sort of how we share food with others and some of the sort of social aspects of food, which, from some of the work I've done with colleagues who are still in Australia, looking at Mediterranean diets in Greece, it's about how we share food. And some of the food can be quite simple and can still be enjoyed.
Interesting. I'm looking forward to talking to you more about this because, yes, definitely want to talk about, the cultural impact of food and the community aspect of food. But before we do that, we're going to do a section called Have You Met Duane, where we talk about some of your favorite things. So the first thing I'd like to know is, what is your favorite book?
I've actually got it next to me here. It's called Scoff. It's a book about food. I like cookbooks as well, and it's by Penn Vogler, and it's about the link between food in Britain and how it interacts with class. So, and we don't even think about this because if you look at the word beef, that's a French word. But if you look at the word ox, that's Saxon. Mutton is from the French. Sheep is from the Saxon. So it differentiates historically through Britain for centuries that the landowners, the ruling classes who are Norman, French, going back 1,000 years, is why it's known for the food, but the animals are the people who looked after it, who were the Saxons, who were the English there before. So you can see all the way through our food culture, names of food, how food's used politically influences our place in society. It's quite an interesting and read. And it has recipes as well, which is a bonus. So you read about something, then you find a recipe, an old one and a new one, which is always good fun.
Oh, I love that. I wrote a book by a chef, and you read about this beautiful dish that he made with his mum, and then you're like, oh, I really wish I could make that. The next page, that's the recipe I wanted. Though I haven't actually used any of the recipes. One day. And what about a movie you've enjoyed recently?
So that's a good question. Probably the one I like recently is Spirited, which is the alternative version of the Christmas Carol. I watched a few weeks ago, and it's a musical, but it's tongue-in-cheek and it's slightly naughty, and sort of it's very, very funny, but very, very well put together.
Okay, has it come out recently?
I think it came out the Christmas before last. It was on Apple TV, so it was Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds. So it's not the sort of people you expect in a musical, but it's that alternative Scrooge story, which is really quite good and really cleverly put together.
Okay, I'll have to put that on my list for next Christmas.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend it.
Great, thank you. And do you listen to any podcasts?
I've got into one recently. I don't know if you get it in Australia, but in the UK we have a program called QI, which is quite interesting. Yeah, the people, the elves who write all the facts there, they have a podcast called "There's No Such Thing as a Fish." Yeah, for sensitive English ears, you have to have a warning about the language because it can be a little bit sweary at times. But from living in Australia, it's probably sort of fairly standard.
It'll be fine. You hear much worse on the train, I expect.
Yeah. So
what's the podcast about?
It's sort of, they come up with random facts that they hear in the news. And it could be anything from the size of a whale heart to something really random. They go into the details behind it and just talk about it. These 4 sort of fact finders that find out interesting, peculiar things. And they talk about it with humour. And it's really quite deep. It's one of the BBC podcasts now. I think it was somewhere else before. But that's a good podcast for if you like sort of something that really challenges your brain, but is also quite funny.
Great, thank you. And so is it, I guess, facts that they didn't use on QI that they're reusing for this, or?
I haven't heard anything on QI, so there might be some things that are linked, but they did a good one going up to Christmas and the New Year, and there's sort of seasonal things and various. So it's a really quite sort of thought-provoking. It's about an hour long, so it's a reasonable one if you're commuting.
Yeah, great, perfect. And do you have a role model?
I have probably a couple, and they're both managers. One's just retired, and they're probably a role model because they deal with whatever's thrown at them in such a calm, kind way. And I sort of aspire to be calm in the face of adversity and quite often fail. So I think that's a good role model to have. Professor Cameron, who's just retired from Aston, she is an amazing leader because she's just so calm, whatever happens. And I'm just going, I wish I could be a little bit calmer when things go slightly wrong.
I definitely wish I had that too. I've said a long time ago, I could never be a doctor because as soon as someone's like, someone's dying, I'd be like, what do I do? And I just freak out. So yeah, it sounds, very much someone to look up to.
Yeah, it's a very inspirational person.
Yeah. And have you completed any courses that have inspired you?
I can't say a PhD, unfortunately, because that is hard work and a very selfish thing to do because you're just about producing research for yourself. I'd probably have to go to is the management course I did when I was in Canberra at the university there. And it's like leadership from the middle and solving problems. And it's a really inspiring course, but also very frustrating because if you go into environments when you're not able to think that this is a thing that really irritates me here, let's get together and solve it. And if you're in a place where you can't do that, it gets quite irritating. But generally, it's quite inspiring that you go like, right, let's not put up with things in a workplace, in a day-to-day, which irritate us. Let's look for solutions. And if we can bring the solutions, surely that'll make better for other people because if it irritates me, it's more likely to irritate you as well. So let's get together and solve it. So that was a really good management course that I had there at the university.
That sounds good. I think I've definitely been in, jobs where I really wanted to change something, but I didn't have the tools to know how to change things. So it sounds like it'd be very, very useful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no worries.
So before we get started in our topic today, I like to start off with some, definitions so that everyone knows where we're starting from. The first thing I'd like to know is, how do you define household management?
Wow, that's a big area. That's from what we're talking about with food, it's about understanding what goes into recipes, how you prepare them. But also, if you're trying to manage that, you might be trying to think, right, is there something I can get that can go into 2 or 3 dishes, or how can I make it into 2 or 3 meals? I wouldn't say I'm not a good person for lists or planning what I eat, but I try and have things I can link through meals, so you've got things going for a number of days. And I think, if you look at the classic sort of British cookbooks, the Mrs. Beeton's, that's probably how she would have defined it as well. So I think I'm in good company.
I actually really like that. A lot of the people we've had on the show before, they're like, make a list, decide what you want to eat for the week. And I think that's great for some people, but I can't do that. And so I think the idea of picking a few things that you'll use through the week, even if you don't plan it out, is really great. What are some examples of ingredients that, you use regularly?
So sort of, it just depends on the sort of seasonality. So sprouting broccoli is a good one because you can use that for dipping. You can actually use it sort of as a vegetable, or you can chop it up and put it in something like a risotto or a stir fry. So it's very, very flexible. Bell peppers, I think capsicum peppers, depending on what you want to call them. We just call them peppers. They're a good one as well. And sort of then you've got the basics of the onion, your garlic, your carrots, your celery, which is the basis of any good sauce or any dish. Having some lentils around and some cans of beans, and then you can just throw things together with some tomatoes. I've started to use a lot of pulpa because it's a bit more sort of, it's not quite as smooth as passata, but it's got not quite as lumpy as chopped tomatoes. So if you've got cans of chopped tomatoes, you can use that for a base of a chili, a curry, bolognese type sauce. You've got a whole range, and that's just, so they're very basic things that then you can just change the flavour with your dry ingredients, your spices from your store cupboard.
Okay, that's a great idea. And I love how you've got a few fresh ingredients, but you've also got some shelf-stable ones because, I've definitely been in the situation where I've only got some cans of beans in the cupboard and, some tomatoes, and I've been able to make a meal with that.
And I think the other thing that some people are afraid of, where they see, so they've got a head of broccoli, for example, that's going a bit over, they'll think, well, I'll just bin that, rather than thinking, well, I could make a broccoli soup with that, and that's going to give it another 3-4 days life. And sort of it's actually thinking about some of your fresh ingredients that are not looking as fresh. How can I quickly cook something that will give it extra life so I'm not wasting it? And hopefully that's something we can look at, because if we're talking about sustainability and thrift, that's a classic traditional way of doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, great. Let's talk about that in a little bit. But you also have brought up, what is sustainable cooking? How is it different from normal cooking?
Well, it's looking to try and, I could almost look at it, it's almost trying to look slightly lazy at cooking as well, because it might be sort of trying to use less pans, because if you're using less pans, you're heating less pans. It's actually looking at sort of more convenient, quicker ways of eating, because you're not heating for so long. If you're heating an oven for a long period of time, that's a lot of energy. But if you're using something like a microwave, that's a lot quicker. I personally don't have an air fryer because of space, but I know that's a great way of being sustainable. And then you're actually using the right size pans as well. You're not heating too much water, more than you need, more of the pan than you need. So it's actually thinking about how you're going to use energy. So it can be a little bit lazy because you generally make less washing up, but also you can be thrifty because you'll spend less money on energy.
Okay. So so being sustainable and being thrifty is a lot about reducing the amount of energy that you use while cooking.
And then you're also looking at things like ingredients and trying to eliminate the concept of food waste. You're trying to look at how you can to manage that food and, try and have the minimal amount going out the end. And if possible, turning that into compost, where, it's nice if you've got sort of a space to grow things you can then use to grow. Even that growing food can be massively impactful sustainably. It reminds you to be sort of careful of what you're using, not trying to use more than you need.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't want to be throwing away all those tomatoes that I've just carefully grown from the soil.
Yeah, I had an experiment. We had a load of tomatoes left over, and had a high-kind student gave me some of their tomatoes, and my wife grew some sort of navy beans, and I made homemade baked beans. I wouldn't recommend it. It takes so much effort, but to actually try it as an experiment. It was worth doing, but, you know, cans of baked beans are probably more environmentally friendly because they don't last for a long time. They're made on bulk and sort of, yeah. So as an experiment, it was good. It meant the tomatoes weren't wasted, but I wouldn't possibly recommend it all the time.
Okay, that's good to know because I love baked beans, and maybe that would be something that I would look at making because, you know, I've got beans, got tomatoes, but yes, okay, we'll just stick with the store-bought. So I've got a few questions because you mentioned that like something like an air fryer is more environmentally friendly than using, I don't know, a stove or an oven. I thought that having more appliances would be worse for the environment.
So yeah, it's a balancing act, definitely. So the more piece of equipment you've got, the more resources, energy you need to go to make them. So it's being selective about which ones you have. You know, most people have a microwave. You know, some people have been a bit sniffy about microwaves and the health effects. There's no grounding that in science. And a microwave will typically use, 700 to 1,000 watts, depending on the power. You know, an oven's going to use twice that. You know, personally, because, sort of from a family point of view, we're vegetarian, we tend to use a lot of stews and, being in the UK, cold things. So we have a slow cooker. They're a good thing to have, the crock pots, which, that's probably the way we'll go rather than air fryers because we don't have meat and you'd use air fryers, because your air fryer, you cook meat a lot quicker with a lot less energy than using an oven. And so, and so some people, depending on what you cook, pressure cookers can be good because they cook quicker. So if you're thinking about things that are slightly smaller, the right size for what you're cooking, but also things that cook quicker, so they're using less energy because it's a simple bit of physics. Watts times time, time is the amount of energy you use. So you want to cook for less time using a smallest amount of energy.
That reminds me, my mom and I made these traditional Chinese rice balls called zheng or zhengzi. And traditionally, you have to cook them for 9 hours over the stove. And I was like, I can't do that. That is too long to be standing there stirring these things. So we used her air pressure or her pressure cooker, and it took an hour. And I just think the energy difference between those two things, and the time of me having to be there at the stove, would be huge. So you mentioned that you're vegetarian, but so I eat meat occasionally, and so sometimes I buy the cheaper cuts of meat, something like a chuck steak, and we slow cook them in the oven because we don't have a slow cooker. Is that more environmentally friendly than like eating a steak that is cooked quickly? I guess because you have to cook the chuck steak for longer. I mean, what's the weighing up there?
I think it's probably down to the method of cooking because it's a lower temperature, so it's going to be using slightly less energy. So that's on the plus side. It's in an oven, so it depends how big the oven is. So if you're doing a main oven, you're going to be using more energy than the top oven. You might want the convection there. So it's actually looking at those factors. A slow cooker will be clearly the best bet because if you're looking at something like a chuck steak, you don't need a lot of temperature. You just need a lot of time to break down those connective fibers. You could look at the flip side, which is better. There's probably more chuck steak on a sort of the cattle than there would be the finer steak. So, this will be stuff that potentially not going to the food chain or go elsewhere in the food chain. So, you've got to weigh all these different factors up. Probably having sort of a small sort of way of heating it in water to sort of that slow temperature might be the most efficient way of doing it. It would be done in a culinary setting, would probably something like a bain-marie. Although there might be plastic if it's wrapped. Let's not go into too many complexities there. So, it's possibly not the best way, but there are worse ways. So you're looking at trying to step down to do the best way you can for the foods that you enjoy, that are culturally appropriate and affordable. So it's not a bad way of doing it. But also, if you can then use things like the stock that comes off it and sort of make several meals out of it, if you're making more than one meal out of it because you're batch cooking, that's going to sort of up its sort of sustainable credibilities.
Okay, so maybe instead of doing like one serve of this stew that I'm making, maybe do 4 or 5 serves and then freeze some of it or use some of it for a pie the next day.
Yeah, and that's perfect because we need to look about food safety. So you've got to remember the 2 hour rule. So you get it down below 20 degrees in 2 hours, and to fridge temperature at least in the next 2 hours. So that's important. You need to make sure it's covered so the bacteria that can cause tummy bugs don't get in there. And so if you're looking at nutrition wise, in something like a stew, you can add beans or lentils to add in the protein and the iron. You'd have the vegetables, have the vitamin C, so the iron still works and available. So you can actually still get a very nutritious stew, and you're using the meat more for flavour and some of the texture rather than being the bulk ingredient. I think there's a really good sustainability chef in Sweden, I think, who sort of goes, well, we need to move the meat from being the rock star lead singer and bring forward the vegetables so it's more balanced. And if you look traditionally at how most cultures are, if you look at the UK culture, particularly during the Second World War and rationing, meat was there as a small thing, as a flavour. But over the last few decades, it's become a sort of more times a week and almost a daily or even more than a daily thing. And is that really sustainable? And also, it's very expensive. So, the idea of sustainability and thrift can go quite neatly there by bulking out with sort of cans of beans, or if you're stewing, lentils will cook down nicely and take on the flavour very well. So you'll still get the flavours and the things that you enjoy, but you can save a little money in the process.
Mm-hmm. I did notice that when we were in Vietnam, a lot of the soups were like meat stocks or meat soups, but they didn't have like that much meat in them. It was more like a flavor that went with the noodles. And so I see where you're coming from. Like we still want the flavor of the meat, but it doesn't have to be the main star. So yeah, do you have any other tips, I guess, if you're trying to be a bit more thrifty?
I think we've already touched on the one about batch cooking. I think to make it even more thrifty is if you put it in the freezer, you take it out the freezer and try and sort of put it the day before or the night before and allow it to thaw out in the fridge rather than trying to use heat to thaw it, because that's going to take more energy. So you naturally allow it in appliances that are already on. I think that's a good one. Being smart when you're shopping, sort of, if you're looking at things like breads and sort of some fresh things, get them near end date because that can save you a little bit of money, then freeze them. I'd always recommend putting bread in a freezer rather than a fridge because you'll stale quicker in a fridge because the starches tighten up, but a freezer it sets them so that doesn't happen to it. And sort of, again, having a good store cupboard of flexible ingredients, we've already talked about that, so things like tin tomatoes and probably a batch of you probably need about 3 spices in each sort of flavour range. So you can go for your Mexican type food, or you can go to your Indian type food, or you can sort of go across to your Southeast Asian food, and so you can adapt between them quite nicely. And I think if you've got that good store cupboard of probably 10, 12 spices, some of them may be pre-mixed, so you can have just 4 for the different flavours you like if you want. That'll be a good tip as well.
Do you mind sharing maybe what some of those spices could be that are really that you recommend using for these different types of food?
So if you're looking at, I'd say one of the critical ones will be cumin, because you use cumin in both the curry with chili, and I'd actually put cocoa powder in there as well. So it gives a really rich chili flavour, and that works really well in a slow cooker. Or you can, if you want to be lazy, you don't even need the chili because you can have your kidney beans already in a chili sauce. That makes it even lazier. So that's sort of those ones. The cumin would go with turmeric, and we could use a curry powder or a garam masala with chili with a bit of ginger and garlic to make a curry. If you go in sort of Southeast Asian, you'd probably keep something that's either citrus or lemongrass type flavors. With, again, chili will probably go in there. And you can get away with ginger if you haven't got something like gangal in that way. So you can flex around with quite a small number of flavors together. It's only if you go into the European flavors, you probably need things like rosemary, basil, thyme, and then you can twist it. You might, if you want to go slightly towards the Turkish, you put a bit of cumin in there. So you can flex them across the different palettes with just a small number of flavors. And it's again, not knowing the ones that they like and the ones your family like. And if you want to go to Germany, you start putting things like dill in there as well to give a slightly different, and parsley for the more Northern European flavors.
Okay. I don't like parsley, so I never have any parsley in my kitchen. But yeah, that sounds like my kitchen. I use a lot of cumin, as you said. It seems to go into just so many things.
Yeah, and sort of you think when you start cooking, cumin is just for curries, but then you actually look it out. No, it's actually a lot of Middle Eastern cooking. It's a lot of it sort of goes into some of that sort of Turkish sort of crossing over Greek type cooking, and it goes very well into the Mexican food as well. It goes nicely with chilies and just gives that rounded sort of fuller flavour with the spice.
Yeah, I was very surprised because I think growing up, I didn't use much cumin because my family are Dutch and Chinese, not much cumin there. But, cooking my own food, we're doing, Mexican chilies. And I say Mexican, I say any of these with a caveat, not very authentic. But curries and Middle Eastern food, we all cook a lot of those and a lot of cumin there. So thank you for validating me, I guess.
And I think we sort of need to be careful about saying something being authentic, because one of the things I like playing around with all this, a bit fiddly, is a katsu, which is considered to be a Japanese curry dish. It's not. It's a Japanese take on how the English took on a curry dish, which is actually a morph of sort of the Indian curry. So it's actually a morph of a morph of a morph sort of thing. So we do have these various sort of cuisines which we put tweaks on. I work in Birmingham, which is the home of the Balti. That was actually made first in Birmingham by people who came over from Bangladesh. Food changes with the culture it goes into, as long as we don't try to claim it's authentic and actually celebrate the flavours. We can sort of learn from cultures. And I think sort of if we're looking at the environmental and thrift, and it goes back to that meat discussion we're having, is we need to remember some of those simple foods. If you look at the simple street foods of the chana dals, the chickpea curries that you get into parts of North India, or if you go to parts of Europe where you have the Tuscan soups or the bean soups, these are simple, hearty dishes which are easy to make, sometimes are quite quick to make, and they're a lot healthier. What we tend to do as societies get richer is we want more of the meat and the fatty foods and the longer cooked foods. And we've got to sometimes think, well, let's go back to simplicity at times.
So, I mean, maybe this seems a little bit basic, but why is it, more environmentally friendly and cheaper to eat plant-based rather than having more meat?
Well, if you look at some of the dried pulses, they're easy to move around because they're dried and small. They're cheaper, sort of. I'll use dollar for dollar because I know I'm talking to. In terms of buying for protein, a sort of cents per sort of gram of protein. Yeah. Also, they're sort of using much lower resources. So in terms of water resources, carbon emissions, they tend to be lower. Sometimes we need to think about how they're transported. We don't want to be flying herbs around the world, ideally, because that's not good. The idea of asparagus, talking from someone in England, I wouldn't touch asparagus before it starts coming in late April, May, June, and then it goes again because it's a short life crop and we should enjoy these things seasonally. So it's looking at things that take up less land, less resource, and that's why it's more sustainable. And sort of from a thrift point of view, they tend to be cheaper because they're seen as the more simple foods. And if you look at what we know about the health effects of things like the Mediterranean diet, it's a bit odd if you look at the science. If you look in poorer communities that have adopted that diet, it doesn't seem to work. But if you look at the traditional communities, and the original research was in places like Crete, it was a simple, almost peasant diet of the plants that are growing on the herbicides, the vegetables they could grow, the olives that they had. It was things that were available. And rather than things that are more sort of on the demand, on the rapid way we get food now. So there's a health message there that it seems that simple, available, varied food is good. It tends to have a lower impact on the planet. And also sort of it tends to be a little bit cheaper because it's available at that time. There tends to be more of it growing at that time.
Okay, so it's interesting what you're saying about the Mediterranean diet, that it's not actually about what's in the Mediterranean diet, but it's more the culture around how you're finding the food for the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah, and sort of they tried to mimic that in the Brazilian dietary guidelines. It's about how you go to the market, how you prepare food with others, how you share food. And UNESCO looked at the sort of the intrinsic parts of Mediterranean diet, and it's more than just the food. It's the culture, it's how it's shared, how it's prepared. And we need to look at those aspects. And, we haven't mentioned it as a potential way of sort of being more sustainable and more thrifty. If we share what we cook, someone else hasn't got to spend money on cooking and buying. So, and if that goes, we could possibly be a lot more kinder by sharing food with others, and that'll also be more sustainable. And would it be nice to celebrate and share food with others? Not having fancy dinner parties to show off, but that act of simple kindness.
That's true, because maybe cooking, if you had, a couple of neighbors, then maybe you could cook twice a week. It's not just the food that you're not, maybe you spend a bit more money when you cook to make the food, but you're not spending that time producing the food. So you can spend that time doing something else, like, spending time with friends or cleaning or something.
Yeah, and sort of it's intrinsic in many cultures across the world. You can look at that sort of famous painting of the Last Supper. Or I remember going to Singapore, I wasn't allowed to talk to one's boss until we had food together. Sharing food is part of what humans do, and we should celebrate that more.
Okay. It's funny, though, because I find that when I'm in a, I guess, a social environment where we're sharing food, I tend to eat, I feel like I eat more. Maybe it's not true. But and I'm thinking maybe it's also because we're going to parties or going out for dinner. But something like yum cha, where you get all these little bites that come to the table, and then you eat and you eat and you eat. And because you're eating slowly, you don't realize that you're eating so much. Does that make an impact, I guess, when you're sharing food?
Well, if you actually look at the studies, and if you're looking at comparing like for like food, we know that a lot of people in the modern world will eat food in front of a screen or a device. So they're not aware of how much they're eating. So they might be thinking they're eating less, but actually they're not. They're eating more. They're not allowing their appetite signals to be triggered. Whereas if you're eating company, you're eating more slowly, which allows the chance for the biology to tell you're full. So you may think you're eating more, but there's probably little difference, or you might actually be eating slightly less. The only challenge is if you're eating socially, is the food slightly richer, and that might have an effect on the amount of energy and those sort of things. But generally, eating socially, people tend to have more control over what they're eating because they're eating more mindfully, they're more aware. And also sort of the value of sharing food is powerful. Where it becomes problematic is where we have cultures where you're almost told it's rude not to eat all the food on the plate. So it's actually being able to order the right amount. That's a cultural, societal thing that, you can't have your dessert until you've eaten everything on the plate. Yeah, that's sort of embedded in a number of societies. That's probably the problem. But generally, as human beings who eat with other people, we tend to be more aware, eat more slowly, and that can actually help us regulate our appetite a little bit better.
And there's also, if you're sharing something, you don't want to take more than your fair share of whatever's out there, or at least that's what I'm aware of when I'm eating. And so I tend to eat slower because I'm like, I've got to make sure that the other people have a chance to eat everything as well.
And I think a real positive way of looking at that is you go, right, I want every other people to enjoy this as well. Rather than thinking, this is all mine. It's better to go like, yeah, this is a great gyoza. You have one, you have one, you have one. So you're sharing it out and really enjoying these great dumplings you have.
Yeah. And are there other cultural aspects of, cuisine that maybe, we can take, to be a bit more environmentally friendly or to reduce the amount of money that we're spending, or even, health-wise?
That's a good question. I think we're probably looking at the speed. So, if you're looking at flash frying, sort of wok frying, although they can use a lot of energy to heat it up, that can be a good one. It's sort of having those sort of herbs, and you can just grab a few herbs in your garden. That adds a lot of flavour. So that's a positive in terms of flavour. And there may, although I'm sceptical on the science, in labs, animals and in cells at least, you have a mixture of herbs and spices that we get from different cuisines. They seem to have sort of benefits in cell cultures. I'm not convinced that we can consume enough as a human to do that, but at least the flavours are nice and they're not likely to do any harm, So I think from traditional cooking, I think a variety of foods. And if you actually look at some cultures where they eat a wider variety of plants, they seem to have a sort of better gut health, and what we call the microbiome, the bacteria in the colon tends to be more varied and healthier. We have to be careful when we look at our data, because some of these traditional communities also have a lot more parasites and other things in the gut that we don't want. So we need to be careful when we're looking at this. So I think the variety is a good thing. The rapid street food way of cooking, which uses less energy because it's quick. But then we need to remember to include sort of some of the sort of ways of just grabbing sort of the edible greens that are available to add a little bit more sort of vegetables to what we're eating.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm currently growing some herbs. Hopefully I'll have enough to cook with one day.
Yeah, so the main one that I've got that keeps going is the rosemary, which is always good for a variety of uses.
Yes, I got to plant that next. So you also mentioned like a few like food preparation tips. You said like making compost. Were there some other ones as well?
I think the main one is looking at how you can use the vegetables and keeping an eye on sort of the salad trays and the vegetables in your fridge to try and look at things so you're aware. And let's go back to household management. You're aware of what could be going off next. So you can either cook it and make it into a soup. I think sort of modern society is sort of praising the smoothie over the soup, and what is a soup but a hot smoothie? Let's look at it in a positive way. It's a way of packing lots of vegetables, a lot of nutrients into something, and they are nice and filling. Particularly, I'm in winter here at the moment, so it's ideal. There are a few cold soups, for a hot Australian summer, but it's actually looking at how we can sort of extend the healthy life of food, and then sort of the other thing will be having sort of containers so you can sort of seal them off so you can keep them fresher for longer. So having sort of reusable containers would be another tip.
Okay. I think, so you mentioned before that like foods that are starting to go off and putting them into soup. Do you have any tips of like how to know if they're too far gone? Because my partner and I throw out a lot of food because it's starting to go yellow, and he's a little bit picky about what he eats and what he doesn't eat.
So if you're looking at broccoli, if it's starting to go a little bit yellow, but it hasn't got any of the furry white bits in, it's probably okay. Yeah, you can chop that up. A simple broccoli soup would be a potato, onion, garlic, the broccoli, some stock. And if you want, you can put some cheese in there just to give it a bit of flavour. Smoked cheese would be nice, or you can just use paprika. And paprika and a bit of mustard will give you a great simple soup. And once it's blitzed down to the soup, you won't notice that the green flowers aren't quite as yellow. But the interesting thing with broccoli is it tends to keep longer if it's covered in plastic. So this gives a great dilemma in terms of sustainability. You can have a week-long shelf life of your broccoli if it's wrapped in plastic, but you've got the problem with plastic. How do we do? So unless we're going to, I've got my broccoli without plastic, after 3 days I'm going to make soup with it. If you make that deal, you're probably okay. Otherwise, you risk throwing a lot of it out. If your potatoes are starting to go green there, and you need to make sure that's a no-no, because they can upset our stomachs because there's toxins in the green potatoes. So it's making sure you store them well. It's sort of not in a fridge, because potatoes don't like fridges. They tend to go a bit sweet. So it's knowing the right temperature to store them at, and sort of make sure there's a bit of a gap between those and things like onions, and they're both kept in a dark, reasonably cool place. So it's actually knowing how to store things will be another useful thing, particularly with vegetables. But if they're starting to go like an eggplant or aubergine's going a bit soft, just keeping an eye on it. As long as it's not sort of going sort of mouldy in there, and it's still it's just drying out a little bit, that's fine. Carrots will go a bit wobbly. Again, you can use those in a soup, but as long as they're not going sort of too slimy and sort of got mold going through them. If there's a little bit of slime on them, you can wash them, cut them up, and they'll be fine to use. Just make sure, they're firm with the bits that you're using.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hopefully we'll be throwing out a bit less food, particularly those carrots. They tend to go quite floppy quite quickly.
Yeah, and sort of we tend to keep ours on the side crisp, and they tend to last a bit longer. But again, you can either sort of dice them and put them into like a bolognese type dish, or even into the base of a pie filling, or you can sort of use sort of a carrot soup. As long as you're okay with coriander, you can put them with coriander. But as carrot and lentil soup, that's a sort of a hearty soup you can make that way as well.
I feel like we've covered a lot. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we moved on to the next section?
I don't know. I think it's been a good general conversation about food, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there anything like, I don't know, if you wanted to get into something more particular, or do you want to save that for the open mic?
I'm just trying to think. I was thinking resources. I think it's just talking to people, really. Mm-hmm. No, I'm trying to think of any particular resources, and I can't think of any. Yeah, I suppose the only resource I'd probably think about is having a bank of recipes. So if you've got some ingredients, and I think the thing that sort of, cookbooks are one thing, but if you're trying to find out how to use the bits of things you've got in the fridge, some people are naturally like the challenge of, like, I've got this recipe, I've got, this evening I had an aubergine, some broccoli and some potatoes to use up. And I made a frittata and sort of like patata bravas with it, and sort of, just had some steamed broccoli with this really nice sort of aubergine frittata. So it's actually, that some people are good. If you're not good at sort of thinking of what can I do with these three ingredients, and I think it goes back to training with a home economist in one of my first jobs as a dietitian. So you had that sort of ready, steady, cook, let's cook with this bag of food thing. There are some great sort of apps and recipe banks that share in communities where you can put in one or two ingredients and they'll give you an idea. Mm-hmm. And if you're looking at recipes, think about the time and the amount of work it needs. And the other tip I'll go is look for recipes that have minimal amount of equipment. Because if you're not heating up lots of pans and putting lots of things in the oven, it's going to help save energy. So I think use recipes, look for recipes, but look for the quicker ones that help you use ingredients up, but also ones that use less bits of crockery and pans.
Yeah. And then also, I guess, if you've made something, you've really liked it, maybe saving it so you can find it later for when you have the same dilemma. Yeah,
I'm terrible at writing recipes down and I have to remember them. I've got it's coming to Burns night on this week and I've got to remember how to make a haggis. I made a really good one last time and I can't quite remember the recipe. So I think I know it, but I need to be better at doing that.
I did create for myself a folder of recipes that we make regularly, maybe not so environmentally friendly in the sense that I'm printing off pieces of paper and putting them into little pockets, but it actually is very useful because then the paper doesn't get wet.
And then I guess the other thing is with smartphones, we can take pictures of the food, so at least we can try and work out what we did, even if we haven't written it down.
If you can find the photo, which is always my problem.
That's the other problem, yes.
Yeah. Thank you. We're going to move on to the practices and habits section next. So in your own home, what is a practice you do to manage nutrition and cooking?
I sort of try and base things on vegetables. That's one thing, trying to have at least 2 or 3 different vegetables in each dish and try and think of flavours I enjoyed, because I remember sort of a European conference as this it seemed very wise. I'm sure they are very wise, but they came across me very wise. Catering or food service dietitian who said, it doesn't matter how nutritious the food is on the plate, if it's not eaten, its value is 0. So I think the idea is trying to have sort of at least 3 vegetables in there and then sort of trying to work out how to make it tasty.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of when I was a kid. I was just getting into cooking. I was like, I'm going to make a raw tomato soup because it sounds really fancy. I forgot I hate tomato.
It's a problem. If it's not eaten, that's not sustainable and it's not nutritious.
Because I probably just ended up eating bread and then not eating the soup. But also, in my household, we have a philosophy. It doesn't matter how much olive oil or salt we put on a vegetable, as long as we eat the vegetables and we eat plenty of vegetables. Would you say that's a good way to go?
I think the evidence for olive oil say you can't really it's hard to put too much olive oil in a vegetable because, you're just going to be dressing it and coating it. The salt, possibly with a reason, because the evidence about salt's not so good. I'd probably go for herbs and spices to get a bit of flavour. So I'd probably encourage you to think about a bit of sort of black pepper first before reaching for the salt. Okay.
Good to know, because I think the olive oil is what really makes it. So happy with that. So back to your practices of cooking mostly vegetables. do you have any like recommendations of like the best ways that you like to cook your vegetables?
I'd probably go for steaming and stir frying best, sort of, and if you look at vegetables, there's a balancing act, and there's always a balancing act with food. One, if it's fresher and cooked less, there'll be more vitamins in it. However, unless it's a very tender sort of vegetable, it's got these sort of tough walls in there, the fibrous walls, and they're hard to break down. So if you look at tomatoes as an example, they're better having them cooked in olive oil to get all those pigments out so your body's got a chance of getting hold of them. And similarly with carrots, the carotenoids, the orange pigments, are easy to get out of a very soft, overcooked carrot than they are if it's either raw or al dente. So yeah, it's not as simple as, you just lightly cook them because that preserves the nutrients. You've got to get them. And I think my tip will be it depends what you want to do with your vegetable. If I'm making risotto, I'll actually boil them in the stock to cook them, and then you just stop to cook the rice off. Then you get the flavours going through, and particularly with something like asparagus when it's in season, asparagus, peas and mint, you can get those flavours nicely going from your stock into your rice, and it flavours the whole dish nicely. But if I'm looking at something like a stir fry, I'll probably just put them in at the right time and stage them to how well cooked I need to be to get the variety of crunch. So something like pak choi, you put right at the end so you still got that crunch in it. But you might want things like the peppers and the onions in earlier so they're nice and soft. And then you just put a little bit of spring onion on the top to get a real crunch. So you're thinking of what the flavours it's going to get out of there, as well as being mindful of the nutritional benefits.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe looking up maybe some of the different nutritional properties of the different vegetables.
Yeah, and sort of if it's got sort of those orange and red pigments, it might, to get the nutrition out of it, you might need more cooking. But if it's things like vitamin C, less cooking, things like broccoli, probably less cooking. And then sort of looking at how does this taste best? Because again, remembering vegetables that aren't eaten are not good for us.
Yeah. So if you eat it, it's better than not eating it. And yeah, great. Thank you for those tips. I've got a few questions that we can maybe talk about. So one of them is some lesser known health benefits of adopting sustainable cooking practices. Would you be able to talk about that?
Just trying to think what they mean by lesser known.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. That's why I'm asking, because I'm like, I don't know. If not, we can just skip that one.
I guess the lesser known one things, you might try different things and what's his name? Oh, God. Dan Saladino, who's a food journalist over here, he's written a book on sort of eating to extinction, and actually possibly from a sustainability point of view, if we eat slightly different things, it may have sustainable benefits. So if we look at sort of less traditional crops or looking for going back for traditional things, I think sort of a sustainable thing to eating in the UK, I'll put a bias, but I don't like quinoa. I've never liked quinoa. I don't understand why people love quinoa.
So we've got some questions from the audience today. And just for our audience members, if you do want to contribute questions to the show in the future, just check on our Instagram stories, early in the week, maybe Monday or Tuesday. And if we're seeing a guest that week, you'll get a prompt to pop in your questions. But we're going to be asking some questions now to Duane. So our first question is, from a health perspective, what are some lesser known benefits of adopting sustainable cooking practices, and how do these contribute to overall well-being? I
think, if I'm looking at this, there's a food journalist in the UK called Dan Saladino who's written a book called Eating to Extinction. And in that explores the idea of some of the lesser eaten foods and the variety that gives, because you're not dependent on monocultures of just growing one crop in one field, or those sort of problems may be beneficial for the planet. So as we're looking for more variety and possibly going back to some more traditional foods, that might be better. I've probably got to declare that I'm not a fan of quinoa. I don't get the fuss about it. But instead of that, I'd use quite a high protein grain in cooking things. It could be sort of pie fillings, it could be stews. which will be things like pearl barley or pearl sprout, which are traditional ones, but sort of not been transported. They're grown in Europe. Their water sort of aspects are probably better as well as the sort of transport. And then that allows the quinoa to be used as a traditional food as it was in Peru, rather than being too expensive for people in Peru. So if we actually look at some of these traditional foods and sort of being careful in Australia, because some of the bush foods might be quite good, but not to exploit them so they're not available, and actually trying to look at getting that variety and sort of, I wouldn't say fully following the seasonality, but trying to be mindful of the production and the travel of our food could be a way of helping to make it a little bit more healthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I think this sort of moves into our next section, our next question, which is, how can households integrate the concept of nose to tail or root to stem cooking to maximize the use of all parts of the ingredients and minimize waste?
So I think the first thing is actually looking at food waste as not as waste, that we're actually looking at the whole process and how we can use that to make soil. And I'm involved in a project because in the UK, the policy is coming through that councils will be obliged to compost food waste, which is quite interesting, and how that's going to be deployed. And it's actually changed that mindset that the food isn't waste when we finish with it. It's actually still useful. And that's how we manage that and become more aware of that. So I think if we're trying to manage how we use food, we need to value what the waste is and then try and look at how we purchase. So we're mindful of how we purchase, and we don't go for those offers of buying those supersized bags of carrots, which we'll know we'll never use. We buy what we need and think how we're going to shop to go, like, not necessarily have a list, as I mentioned earlier, but have an idea of what I might be doing this week and how I can use ingredients so that you're going to be potentially letting less food go off. And the other thing is, how many people, and I'll go back to broccoli because it's a good example, just use the floury bits and ignore the stalk. The stalk is great for making stock. You can even peel it and use it as sort of a snack, as something to crunch on. You can use it for dipping in things. You can slice it thinly and put it into stir fries. We need to think about, how we can use things. Beetroot's another example. If you grow it or have it with the leaves can be used as a replacement for chard or spinach. The stalks can be chopped up and used in stir fry. And then you can use the beets yourself because, I know, Australia is one of those things you tend to have in a burger. That can go in the burger if you have to have one.
Yes, or in salads. I feel like beetroot became a really big thing in salads.
Yeah, and sort of you can even make a good curry with the beetroot. You can use it in so many different ways. I was sorry being flippant and sort of that stereotype of the Australian burger with a bit of beetroot in it. Yeah, but we've got to remember the leaves and the stems as well. So there's a lot of these vegetables we can be more sort of smart how we use. And we sometimes see them. Don't tend to get them in the UK, but we get them. The kohlrabi, which is the cabbage beet. The cabbage turnip. You've got an example of, you've got leaves there you can use, but also you've got the actual turnip itself. So it's actually thinking of how we can use more parts of the plant to get the flavours and the different textures out of that. So I think beetroot's a good example of that.
I did make once a beetroot leaf. I deep fried it and it was delicious. It took so much time though. I've never tried to make it again.
I think probably the easy thing is chop it and wilt it down and use it as spinach.
I'll have to try that. I have to also eat more beetroot then. Thank you for answering our questions today. We'll move on to the open mic now. So that's a chance for you to talk about something that you're passionate about. Did you have something in mind?
I think sort of one of the hottest topics in food and nutrition at the moment is this concept of ultra-processed foods. And it can be quite value-led, I think. And it sort of typifies some of the problems when we talk about food, in that those who have knowledge and often power talk about the food that other people should be eating. And that's not how we really need to think in sort of improving health. We need to work as communities to try and build better food systems. And we also need to recognise that most of us live in cities, so we need some processes in food and some way of packaging food, cleaning food to get it from the farms into the cities and last long enough so it doesn't poison us and gives us the food we need. So I think we need to have a more balanced approach to what we consider as being good food and less healthy food. I think there's a lot of similarity in what we think of what is a healthy diet. It's based on plants, lots of vegetables, lots of fruit, lots of nuts, seeds, pulses, the beans, peas, lentils. We agree on that. It's where we disagree is whether it's about the fat, the salt and sugar, or about the level of processing and the extra ingredients we have in there. I think most of those foods are very similar. So I think we need to break away from this sort of polar argument about this way of eating is bad, this way of eating, and look at how we get more fresh food, or as fresh as possible, or minimally processed food into our cities that's affordable, enjoyable, culturally acceptable, and people can enjoy and eat together. And I think that's where we're losing in this discussion. And if we get that right, that variety of, minimally processed foods, we're getting that sustainability, we're getting that variety, and we're celebrating the cultures that live in our cities. And we need to focus on transforming our food systems to make them fair so they support the health of the planet, and more importantly, the health of the people, and work on sort of the governmental level so the taxations are right, so food companies can make profit, which they legally have to do, but they make profit by supplying us with the food that keeps us healthy and sustains our planet.
Mm-hmm. So would that be something like a tax on sugar, which I think the UK has?
It's technically a levy, which is a bit smarter than a tax.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like a tax, but doesn't quite behave like a tax. So what you do is you put a levy on sort of an amount. So if it's above that amount, you have to pay the tax. And that comes from the producer or bottler, if you look at the soft drinks industry levy in the UK, which means that if you're a producer, you're incentivized to reduce that amount of sugar in the food. Mm-hmm. So if it does exist and the tax is paid, that money should then be diverted to education and research around food and health, which, in governments, it tends to get a bit lost, so it doesn't quite come back in the right form. But the general thing is, they reduce the amount of sugar in food. The only problem that I find is in the UK, you can only get now half sugar, a certain brand of Australian ginger beer. So I can't get the diet one, which you can get in Australia, because they only ship one across, and that's that half one that goes below the sugar tax, which I don't like as much as the diet version.
Oh, and surely the diet version is better than the half sugar version.
It's much more spicy because the sugars tend to coat the tongue. So if you're looking at ginger beer, I like the spicier one. So that's a personal preference, but it's one of those products that you go like, it's messed up one thing for me, but it's probably had benefits for society in different ways. And you can put those levies into sort of things like, we've got a problem. We have this thing called Brexit, which is not working out brilliantly in terms of food sector. And that means that we have to grow our own sugar to produce sweets that then we can export to other countries. And that's then led to decisions that allow certain types of pesticides, which are not good for bees, to be authorised for special use on sugar beet. So we are causing harm in our food policies where we could actually be doing better. And surely if we had a sensible food system, we wouldn't be growing sugar in the UK, but we're using that great land to grow things that are healthy and then allow other countries to grow sugar that's needed that helps boost their economy and sort of, so it's cane sugar versus beet sugar. We need to be smarter and then sort of use all this computing power and artificial intelligence in a clever way to work out where these levies and levers need to be to actually make the diets healthier and make sure the sustainability bit's covered, make sure the health's covered, but make sure the cultural mix of our communities get the food that allows them to identify with food, because we do identify with food. We do have those special dishes which attaches to our family and our place, and we need to remember that's important as well.
Okay. This is a very complex, balancing everything is very complex. And not sure we're going to get it right, but hopefully we're getting closer.
Yeah, and sort of working in Birmingham, they do have a food system strategy, which the council have been really bold at creating, which has this health, this sustainability, but also recognises that the food industry, the food sector, is a way of getting people into employment. It's a way of getting people back into education who are out of work. So it's actually getting those three pillars together. And if you get them working together, you should be able to move a city forward successfully, as well as getting those health outcomes. So by having that bold vision, I believe it is possible, but it's not simple.
Yeah, okay. And we'll keep working towards it.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. If our listeners want to find out more about you or about your work, where can they find you?
So my work will be found at Aston University, sort of in their Research Explorer. I'm on sort of Twitter, or we call it X, I believe we have to call it now, at Dr. Duane, D-U-A-N-E-R-D. And so my email is the same, but at gmail.com.
Great. And we'll put those in the show notes so everyone can find you easily. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you. It's been good fun.
Yes, it's been great. You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Joustra. Thanks for tuning in.